My name is Joaquin Ramirez Santos. I'm a Hollywood actor who survived the first 48 hours of the zombie outbreak that destroyed Phoenix. What started as a movie premiere turned into a nightmare when an energy drink triggered a citywide infection. I watched people I knew turn into monsters. I led survivors through hell using skills I thought were just for cameras. This is how I stayed alive when civilization collapsed in 2 days. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I need to tell you something about July 15th, 2025. That was the day I learned the difference between playing a hero and being one. My name is Joaquin Ramirez Santos, and I was just another mid-tier Hollywood actor trying to make it in the business. I specialized in action roles, the kind where you get beat up for a living and pretend to save the world. I'd spent years learning stage combat, firearms handling, and tactical movement for movies that nobody would remember in 5 years. I thought those skills were just for show. I was wrong. The Desert Ridge Resort in Phoenix was supposed to be a simple stop on our promotional tour. Our new action thriller, Desert Strike, was getting its Arizona premiere, and I was there to shake hands, smile for cameras, and give the same rehearsed interviews I'd been doing for weeks. The studio had booked the entire grand ballroom for the event. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, ice sculptures shaped like our movie's logo. It was the kind of over-the-top Hollywood spectacle that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Phoenix was experiencing one of its worst heat waves on record. The temperature had hit 118 degrees that day, and even the locals were calling it extreme. The resort's air conditioning was working overtime, but you could still feel the desert heat pressing against the windows like something alive and hungry. Everyone was drinking constantly, trying to stay hydrated in that oppressive Arizona summer. That's where Vital Boost came in. The energy drink company was our premier's official sponsor, and they had flooded the event with their product. Servers carried trays of the distinctive neon green bottles. Ice sculptures were molded to look like Vital Boost containers, and there were promotional displays everywhere. The stuff was ice cold and surprisingly refreshing for an energy drink. I remember thinking it was smart marketing, getting people to associate their product with relief from the heat. I should have paid more attention to how many people were drinking it. The party started at 7 in the evening, and by 9 o'clock, the ballroom was packed with 300 guests. Local media, film industry people, contest winners, and VIP ticket holders all mingled under those glittering chandeliers. I was standing near the main bar, nursing a whiskey and watching my co-stars handle interviews with the entertainment reporters. My publicist had scheduled me for a 10 o'clock interview slot, so I was killing time and trying to stay cool in my tailored black suit. Sarah Martinez was our film's producer, a sharp woman in her 40s who had been in the industry longer than I'd been alive. She knew everyone, remembered everyone's names, and had a talent for making every person she talked to feel like the most important person in the room. I'd been watching her work the crowd all evening, Vital Boost bottle in hand, charming investors and press with equal skill. At 9:47, Sarah collapsed. I was checking my phone when I heard the crash. She'd been standing near the appetizer table, talking to a reporter from the Arizona Republic, when her legs just gave out. The sound of her body hitting the marble floor cut through the cocktail party chatter like a gunshot. At first, I thought she'd fainted from the heat. Even with all that air conditioning, the ballroom was still stifling with so many bodies packed inside. But then she started convulsing. Her back arched impossibly high, and foam began bubbling from her mouth. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and her limbs jerked and spasmed like she was being electrocuted. The reporter who'd been interviewing her stumbled backward, nearly dropping his camera. Someone shouted for people to call 911, but nobody moved. We all just stood there, staring at Sarah writhing on the floor. That's when I noticed 3 more people near the vital boost display were collapsing too. The same violent seizures, the same impossible arching of spines, the same foam pouring from their mouths. 4 people, all within seconds of each other, all having identical medical emergencies. My actor's instincts kicked in, that hyper-awareness I used on set to read a scene and understand what was really happening beneath the surface. This wasn't heat exhaustion or coincidence. This was something else entirely. The smell hit me next. It was like spoiled meat mixed with burning electrical wiring, a nauseating odor that seemed to radiate from the collapsed victims. I'd smelled similar things on movie sets when we used practical effects for decomposition scenes, but this was real and it was stronger. The stench made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Sarah's convulsions stopped at 9:52. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone, trying to process what I was seeing and wondering if I should call for help myself. Her body went completely still for maybe 30 seconds. The foam stopped bubbling. Her breathing stopped. For a moment, I thought she had died. Then her eyes snapped open. They were completely white, clouded over like cataracts but somehow still focused. She looked around the ballroom with those dead eyes, and when her gaze passed over me, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There was nothing human left in that stare. No recognition, no intelligence, just a terrible hunger that made my skin crawl. A young waiter, maybe 22 years old, had been kneeling beside her with a cocktail napkin, trying to clean the foam from her face. He was the closest person when Sarah's eyes opened, and she lunged at him with inhuman speed. Her teeth found his throat before he could even scream. The sound of tearing flesh was wet and horrible, and blood sprayed across the white tablecloth like abstract art. That's when the real screaming started. The other 3 victims were getting up too, moving with the same predatory grace, the same clouded eyes, the same terrible hunger. They attacked the nearest people without hesitation, without mercy. A woman in a designer dress went down under 2 of them, her scream cut short as they tore into her arms and face. A man in a tuxedo tried to run but slipped on the marble floor. And the 3rd attacker was on him before he could get up. The ballroom erupted into chaos. People were running in every direction, screaming, pushing, falling over each other in their panic. The crystal chandeliers swayed as bodies pressed against the walls, and I could hear expensive glassware shattering as people knocked over tables and displays. The careful elegance of the premiere dissolved into pure animal terror in seconds. I stood there for maybe 5 heartbeats, watching Sarah tear chunks of flesh from the waiter's neck, and my mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Food poisoning, mass hysteria, some kind of gas leak causing hallucinations. Anything except the obvious truth that my brain refused to accept. Then Sarah looked up from her victim, blood covering her face in designer dress, and those dead white eyes fixed on me. She opened her mouth, and instead of words, she made a sound like a growling animal. Pieces of the waiter's throat were still stuck between her teeth. That's when my training kicked in. I'd spent years doing choreographed fight scenes, learning to move efficiently in chaotic situations, reading the flow of action to find the safest path through danger. It was all fake, all rehearsed, but the muscle memory was real. I grabbed the woman standing next to me, a contest winner who was frozen in terror, and pulled her toward the service corridor I'd noticed earlier when I was getting familiar with the venue layout. The service corridors were something I always scoped out at events like this. Old habit from my stunt work, where knowing every exit and alternate route could mean the difference between a successful take and a trip to the hospital. The Desert Ridge Resort had a network of staff corridors that connected all the major event spaces, designed to let catering and housekeeping move around without disturbing guests. I pushed through the service door with the contest winner and 2 other people who had followed us. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, lined with industrial carpet and smelling of cleaning supplies. Behind us, the screaming in the ballroom was getting worse. I could hear more voices joining in, more people collapsing, more of those horrible growling sounds. The contest winner was hyperventilating. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing a sparkly evening gown that probably cost more than my car payment, and she kept asking what was happening in a voice that got higher and more panicked with each repetition. I didn't have an answer for her. I was still trying to process what I'd just seen, my brain cycling through possibilities and rejecting each one as impossible. The other two people with us were a hotel security guard and a catering manager. The security guard was speaking rapidly into his radio, but all he was getting back was static and confused reports from other parts of the resort. The catering manager was pale and shaking, muttering about how this couldn't be happening, how they'd followed all the health codes, how the food had been prepared safely. That's when I remembered the Vital Boost bottles. Every person who'd collapsed had been drinking them. Sarah had been carrying one when she went down. The people near the display had been sampling new flavors. The connection was obvious once I thought about it, but it raised questions I wasn't ready to consider. How could an energy drink cause people to attack each other? How could it turn them into something that looked human, but acted like a rabid animal? The security guard's radio crackled with a transmission from the front desk. Multiple medical emergencies throughout the resort. Ambulances were on the way, but the 911 system was being overwhelmed by calls from across the city. Similar incidents were being reported at other venues, other events, anywhere Vital Boost had been served that evening. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just our premiere. This was happening everywhere. The catering manager was crying now, talking about how Vital Boost had provided all the drinks for free, how they'd been so grateful for the sponsorship, how they'd served hundreds of bottles throughout the resort that day. Not just at our premiere, but at the poolside bar, the restaurant, the lobby cafe, anywhere guests might want a cold drink to beat the heat. The security guard tried his radio again, and this time he got through to someone at the main security office. The report was worse than I'd feared. The hotel's restaurant was experiencing similar incidents. The pool area was in chaos. The lobby cafe had been evacuated. Every location where Vital Boost had been served was reporting violent attacks by people who matched the same description: clouded eyes, inhuman strength, and an apparent hunger for human flesh. I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Instead of waiting for help that might not come, I led our small group deeper into the service corridors toward the conference center. It was the most defensible location I could think of, away from the main guest areas but with multiple exit routes if we needed to run. The conference center had solid doors, minimal windows, and its own separate ventilation system. As we moved through the corridors, we picked up more survivors. A family of 4 who had been hiding in a storage closet. 2 hotel employees who had barricaded themselves in a laundry room. A young couple who had escaped from the restaurant when the attack started there. By the time we reached the conference center, we had 14 people in our group. The conference center was a large rectangular room with a raised platform at one end and rows of chairs facing it. Industrial carpeting, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of generic hotel decor that looked the same in every city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was secure. We used the heavy conference tables to barricade the main entrances, leaving only one door accessible so we could control who came in. That's when the hotel employee told us about the Vital Boost delivery. She was a housekeeping supervisor who had been working at the resort for 15 years. She remembered the Vital Boost truck arriving that morning because it had been unusual. The company had never delivered to their hotel before, and the driver had been insistent about getting the drinks into refrigeration immediately. He'd mentioned something about the heat affecting the formula, about how the products needed to stay cold to maintain their potency. The temperature outside had been climbing toward record levels all week. The Vital Boost truck had been sitting in that heat for hours, making deliveries across the city. If something in the drink was heat sensitive, if the extreme temperatures had caused some kind of chemical reaction, then every bottle delivered in Phoenix that day could have been contaminated. I was trying to process this information when we heard the first reports on the radio. The hotel security guard had found a battery-powered emergency radio in the conference center's supply closet, and he was scanning channels looking for news about what was happening. Most stations were playing normal programming, but a few were starting to report strange incidents across the Phoenix metropolitan area. Mass violence at a shopping mall, multiple casualties at a sports bar, a college campus on lockdown after students began attacking each other. The reports were scattered and confused, but they all mentioned the same details: sudden violent behavior, inhuman strength, and what witnesses describe as a contagious madness that spread through physical contact. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was terrifying. Vital Boost had been distributed throughout Phoenix that day. The heat had altered the formula somehow, turning it into something that triggered violent psychosis in anyone who consumed it. The infected were attacking others, and those victims were becoming infected too, spreading the condition through bites and scratches. It was like something out of a horror movie, except I was living it instead of acting in it. Our group was growing as more survivors found their way to the conference center. Hotel guests who had barricaded themselves in their rooms, staff members who had escaped from various parts of the resort, people who had been outside when the attack started and had sought shelter in the hotel. By midnight, we had 43 people crowded into the conference center, all of us trying to make sense of what was happening. The radio reports were getting worse. The Phoenix Police Department had issued a citywide emergency alert, telling people to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone displaying aggressive behavior. The mayor was calling for calm, but his statement was interrupted by reports of violence spreading to City Hall itself. The National Guard was being mobilized, but it would take hours for them to arrive from their base in Tucson. Hours we might not have. The hotel's main power grid was still functioning, but the air conditioning was struggling to keep up with the heat and the number of people taking shelter throughout the building. The temperature in the conference center was climbing despite the industrial cooling system, and we were all sweating in our formal wear. The contest winner had changed out of her evening gown and into a housekeeping uniform someone had found. For her, several of the men had ditched their suit jackets and ties. I was trying to organize our group into shifts for watching the barricaded doors when the lights went out. The power failure was sudden and complete. The fluorescent lights, the air conditioning, the emergency radio, everything went dark and silent at once. Outside, we could hear car alarms and sirens, but they seemed distant and muffled. The conference center was buried deep in the resort's interior, insulated from the outside world by layers of concrete and steel. Someone had a flashlight, and in its weak beam, I could see the fear on everyone's faces. The housekeeping supervisor was crying quietly. The hotel security guard was trying to get his radio working again. The family with children was huddled together in the corner, whispering prayers in Spanish. That's when we heard the first sounds from inside the hotel. Breaking glass, running footsteps, screaming that echoed through the ventilation system. The infected had found their way into the resort's interior, and they were spreading through the building like a virus through a bloodstream. Our conference center was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. The security guard managed to get his radio working on backup power, and what we heard made our situation clear. The hotel was overrun. The infected were in the corridors, the guest rooms, the service areas. They were breaking down doors, attacking anyone they found, and creating more infected with every bite and scratch. The resort staff who had been trying to coordinate evacuations were either dead or had fled. We were on our own. I looked around the conference center at the 43 people who were depending on me to keep them alive. The contest winner in her borrowed housekeeping uniform. The family with their frightened children. The hotel employees who knew the building but had never faced anything like this. The other premier guests who had come expecting a glamorous evening and instead found themselves in a nightmare. They were all looking at me like I had answers, like my experience playing heroes in movies had prepared me for this moment. The truth was, I was just as scared as they were. But I also knew something they didn't. I knew that sometimes, when you're trapped in an impossible situation, the only way out is through. The sounds from the hotel were getting closer. Whatever was happening out there was spreading, and it was only a matter of time before it reached U.S. Our barricades might hold for a while, but they wouldn't last forever. We needed a plan, we needed supplies, and we needed to move before the situation got worse. But first, we needed to survive the night. The radio crackled with another transmission, this one from the Phoenix Emergency Management Agency. They were reporting a complete breakdown of city services. Police, fire, and medical responses were suspended due to the extreme danger to first responders. The mayor was evacuating City Hall. The governor was mobilizing the National Guard, but they were still hours away. In the darkness of the conference center, listening to the sounds of civilization collapsing around us, I realized something that changed everything. This wasn't just a local emergency that would be resolved in a few hours. This was the beginning of something much bigger, much worse. This was the end of the world as we knew it. And somehow, I was going to have to help 43 people survive. The first light of dawn came through the conference center's small windows like a revelation. But what it revealed was worse than the darkness had hidden. From our position on the second floor of the Desert Ridge Resort, we could see Phoenix burning. Smoke columns rose from dozens of locations across the city, black pillars against the orange morning sky. Abandoned cars littered the streets like scattered toys, some still running with their doors hanging open where their drivers had fled. A news helicopter had crashed into the side of a downtown office building, its wreckage still smoking. The power had been out for 6 hours, and the conference center was already getting unbearably hot. Without air conditioning, the Arizona heat was turning our refuge into an oven. We'd pushed tables against the windows to block the sun, but the temperature was still climbing. By 7 in the morning, it had to be over 90 degrees inside, and people were starting to show signs of heat exhaustion. The hotel security guard, whose name was Marcus Chun, had managed to establish radio contact with other survivor groups. Throughout the city, what he learned painted a picture that made our situation look almost optimistic. The Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport was overrun. The major highways leading out of the city were blocked by abandoned vehicles and roving groups of infected. The Arizona National Guard had established a perimeter around the metropolitan area, but they weren't letting anyone out. They were containing the outbreak, not rescuing survivors. We were trapped in a city that was eating itself alive. During the night, our group had grown to 48 people as more survivors found their way to the conference center. A maintenance worker who knew the hotel's layout better than anyone. A nurse from the resort's medical clinic who had been treating bite victims before she realized what was happening. A family of 6 who had been staying at the hotel for a wedding that would never happen. Each new arrival brought stories that were variations on the same theme. People drinking Vital Boost, collapsing, reanimating, and attacking others. The nurse, Dr. Patricia Valdez, had been the first to suggest that we weren't dealing with a traditional disease. She'd examined several bite victims before the medical clinic was overrun, and what she'd seen didn't match any known pathogen. The infected weren't just violent, they were fundamentally changed. Their body temperature dropped, their heart rate slowed to almost nothing, and their brain activity showed patterns she'd never seen before. It was like they were dead but still moving, driven by some basic instinct that overrode everything else. The maintenance worker, Jimmy Rodriguez, had been tracking the infected through the hotel security camera system before the power failed. He'd watched them move through the corridors with purpose, not the random wandering you'd expect from people in a psychotic state. They were hunting, coordinating, learning the layout of the building. When they encountered locked doors, they would test them systematically, looking for weaknesses. When they found other infected, they would communicate through gestures and sounds that almost resembled language. These weren't just sick people. They were something else entirely. The debate about what to do next had been raging since dawn. One faction, led by a software engineer named David Kim, wanted to stay in the conference center and wait for rescue. The National Guard was establishing containment zones, he argued, and eventually they would organize evacuation efforts for survivors. All we had to do was hold out until help arrived. The other faction, led by a former security contractor named Maria Santos, wanted to attempt escape while we still had the strength to move. She'd been listening to the radio traffic, and what she was hearing didn't sound like rescue operations. It sounded like the military was treating Phoenix as a total loss, writing off the entire metropolitan area to contain the outbreak. No one was coming to save us. We were on our own. I found myself caught between these two positions, trying to weigh options that all seemed impossible. Stay and risk dying from heat exhaustion or starvation. Leave and risk being torn apart by infected or shot by National Guard patrols. Either way, we were betting our lives on choices made with incomplete information. The debate became academic when Jimmy Rodriguez returned from his reconnaissance mission with news that changed everything. The infected had found the hotel's service corridors. They were moving through the same passages we'd used to reach the conference center, and they were getting closer to our position. The barricades we'd built were solid, but they wouldn't hold forever against determined assault. We had maybe 6 hours before they reached us. The family with 6 children was the first to crack under the pressure. The parents, Tom and Linda Morrison, had been trying to maintain normalcy for their kids, but the stress was showing. The youngest, a boy maybe 7 years old, had been crying constantly since the power went out. The oldest, a teenage girl, kept asking when they could go home, when this nightmare would end. Tom Morrison finally snapped and demanded that someone do something, anything, to get his family out of this situation. That's when Maria Santos made her proposal. She knew Phoenix well from her security work, and she'd identified a route that might get us out of the immediate danger zone. The city's storm drain system ran beneath most of the metropolitan area, originally designed to handle flash floods during the monsoon season. The tunnels were large enough for people to move through. They connected to areas outside the main infection zones, and they were probably empty of infected since the creatures seemed to prefer areas with potential victims. The plan was risky, but possible. We would move through the hotel's basement level to access the storm drain system, then travel underground to a less populated area where we might find vehicles or shelter. The journey would take most of the day, but it would get us away from the resort before the infected broke through our defenses. Dr. Valdez raised the obvious objection. We had 48 people, including 6 children and several elderly individuals. The storm drains would be hot, dark, and potentially dangerous. Some of our group wouldn't be able to make the journey, and we'd be abandoning anyone who couldn't keep up. It was essentially a death sentence for the weakest members of our group. The debate that followed revealed the fault lines that had been developing in our group since the outbreak began. Some people were willing to sacrifice others to improve their own chances of survival. Others believed we had a moral obligation to protect everyone, even if it meant all of us dying together. The contest winner, whose name was Eleanor Patterson, accused Maria Santos of being selfish and heartless. Maria responded by asking Eleanor if she'd rather die with her principles intact. I realized that leadership in this situation wasn't about making popular decisions. It was about making the decisions that gave the most people the best chance of survival. The storm drain plan was cruel, but it was also our only realistic option. Staying in the conference center meant certain death for everyone. At least the tunnel route gave some of us a chance. The vote was closer than I'd expected. 26 people supported the storm drain plan, 22 wanted to stay and wait for rescue. The division was roughly along age lines, with younger people more willing to risk the journey and older people preferring to remain in familiar surroundings. The families with children were split, torn between protecting their kids from immediate danger and avoiding the unknown risks of the underground route. We were preparing to implement the storm drain plan when Jimmy Rodriguez returned with an update that changed everything again. The infected weren't just moving through the service corridors randomly. They were being directed by something, coordinated in a way that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. He'd watched them through the security cameras, and their behavior was too organized to be accidental. They were systematically searching the hotel, room by room, floor by floor, as if they were looking for something specific. They were looking for us. The realization that we were being hunted rather than randomly threatened shifted the entire dynamic of our situation. The infected weren't just mindless creatures driven by hunger. They were predators, and we were their prey. The conference center wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a trap, and the hunters were closing in. Dr. Valdez had been monitoring the radio traffic, and she'd picked up transmissions that supported Jimmy's observations. Military units were reporting that infected groups were showing tactical coordination, using flanking maneuvers and coordinated attacks that suggested some kind of command structure. The National Guard was taking heavy casualties because they'd underestimated the enemy's intelligence. The vote to leave was unanimous this time. We spent the next 2 hours organizing our escape. Jimmy Rodriguez would lead the first group through the basement to the storm drain access point, establishing a safe route for the others to follow. Maria Santos would take the second group, the strongest and most capable individuals who could fight if necessary. I would bring up the rear with the families and elderly, making sure no one was left behind. The plan fell apart before we even reached the basement. The hotel's elevator system was dead, so we had to use the emergency stairwell to reach the lower level. The stairwell was narrow and dark, lit only by battery-powered emergency lights that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. We'd made it down 2 flights when we heard the first sounds of infected in the stairwell below us. They were coming up while we were going down, and we were going to meet in the middle. Jimmy Rodriguez was in the lead, and he held up his hand to stop our descent. We could hear them now, the distinctive shuffling footsteps and low growling sounds that had become terrifyingly familiar. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, climbing the stairs toward us. They'd found our escape route before we could use it. We retreated to the main floor, but the infected were already there too. They'd broken through the hotel's front entrance and were spreading through the lobby like floodwater through a broken dam. The elegant marble floors were covered with broken glass and abandoned luggage. The crystal chandelier hung at an angle, half its bulbs shattered. The reception desk was overturned, its computer screens dark and scattered with papers. We were trapped between 2 groups of infected, caught in the middle of a building that was being systematically overrun. The conference center was no longer accessible, the basement route was blocked, and the main floor was filling with creatures that wanted to tear us apart. Our options were running out fast. That's when Eleanor Patterson made a suggestion that probably saved all our lives. She remembered seeing a service elevator during her tour of the hotel's facilities. It was designed for housekeeping and maintenance, too small for regular guest use, but it had its own power system for emergencies. If we could reach it, we might be able to get to the basement level without using the main stairwell. The service elevator was located in a corridor behind the hotel's kitchen, accessible through a door marked "Authorized personnel only." The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, but it was also empty of infected. We made our way through the kitchen, past industrial refrigerators and commercial ovens, stepping over scattered pots and pans where the cooking staff had fled in panic. The service elevator was smaller than I'd expected, barely large enough for 6 people at a time. With 48 people in our group, we'd need 8 trips to get everyone to the basement. 8 trips through a building that was crawling with infected, with no guarantee that the elevator would keep working or that the basement would be safe when we reached it. The first group made it down without incident. Jimmy Rodriguez reported that the basement level was clear, but he'd found evidence that infected had been there recently. Scratch marks on the walls, bloodstains on the floor, and the distinctive smell of decay that seemed to follow them everywhere, the storm drain. Access was exactly where Maria Santos had said it would be, a heavy metal grate that led to a concrete tunnel large enough for people to walk through. The second group was halfway down when the elevator stopped working. We could hear them inside, trapped between floors, calling for help through the elevator shaft. Jimmy Rodriguez tried to operate the manual controls, but the power system had failed completely. The elevator was dead, and 6 people were trapped inside with no way to get them out. The infected were getting closer. We could hear them moving through the hotel's corridors, searching room by room, floor by floor. The sounds were getting louder, more organized, like they were converging on our position. We had minutes, maybe less, before they found us. I had to make a choice that I still think about every day. We could stay and try to rescue the people trapped in the elevator, risking everyone's lives for 6 people who might already be dead. Or we could abandon them and save the 36 people who still had a chance of escape. I chose to save the 36. We left the elevator and made our way to the basement through the kitchen service stairs. The people trapped in the elevator were calling our names, begging us not to leave them, promising they could get the elevator working if we just gave them more time. I can still hear their voices echoing through the shaft as we descended into the darkness below. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, utility corridors, and mechanical equipment. The storm drain access was exactly where Maria Santos had said it would be, but the grate was locked with a chain and padlock. Jimmy Rodriguez had brought tools, and it took him 20 minutes to cut through the chain while the rest of us watched. The basement entrances for signs of infected. The storm drain tunnel was larger than I'd expected, about 8 feet in diameter, with a concrete floor and curved walls that disappeared into darkness. The air was cooler than the hotel basement, but it carried a stale, musty smell that made breathing difficult. Maria Santos had brought flashlights, but their beams barely penetrated the blackness ahead. We were preparing to enter the tunnel when we heard the elevator crash. The sound echoed through the basement like thunder, followed by screaming that cut off abruptly. The infected had found the trapped elevator and were tearing apart the people inside. 6 people who had trusted me to lead them to safety, who had followed my plan because they believed I knew what I was doing. Their deaths were on my hands. The basement was no longer safe. We could hear infected moving through the corridors above us, and it would only be a matter of time before they found the basement entrance. The storm drain was our only escape route, but it led into unknown territory with no guarantee of safety at the other end. We entered the tunnel in single file, Maria Santos leading, with a flashlight, Jimmy Rodriguez bringing up the rear. The concrete floor was slick with moisture, and the curved walls amplified every sound until our footsteps echoed like gunshots. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, and we had no idea how far we'd have to travel to reach safety. The Morrison family was struggling to keep up. Their youngest child was crying from fear and exhaustion, and the sound carried through the tunnel like a beacon for anything that might be hunting us. Tom Morrison was carrying the boy, but he was already showing signs of fatigue. Linda Morrison was helping their elderly parents, but they were moving slowly and stopping frequently to rest. Dr. Valdez was monitoring the group's condition, and her reports were troubling. Several people were showing signs of dehydration and heat exhaustion. The tunnel was cooler than the hotel, but it was still hot enough to be dangerous for extended travel. We had limited water supplies, and the physical stress of the journey was taking its toll on everyone. We'd been walking for 2 hours when we encountered the first obstacle. The tunnel split into 3 branches, each heading in a different direction. Maria Santos had studied the storm drain maps, but the tunnels didn't match the layout she'd expected. The system was more complex than anyone had realized, with multiple levels and interconnected passages that could easily confuse travelers. We chose the center tunnel because it seemed to slope upward, hopefully toward the surface. The decision was arbitrary, based on guesswork rather than knowledge, but we didn't have better options. The tunnel continued for another hour before we reached a junction with 4 more branches. We were lost. The realization that we were wandering blindly through an underground maze added a new dimension to our fear. The infected behind us were a known threat, but the tunnels ahead were full of unknown dangers. We could walk for hours in the wrong direction, exhaust our water supplies, and emerge into an area that was even more dangerous than the hotel we'd left behind. Jimmy Rodriguez found a maintenance ladder that led to a storm drain cover on the surface. He climbed up to reconnaissance our position, and when he returned, his face was grim. We were still in the heart of Phoenix, surrounded by infected and abandoned vehicles. The National Guard perimeter was miles away, and there was no clear route to safety. The tunnel system was our only option, but it was also our prison. We were trapped underground with limited supplies, no clear destination, and no way to know if we were moving toward safety or deeper into danger. The infected might not be able to follow us into the tunnels, but they didn't need to. All they had to do was wait for us to emerge. The group was starting to fracture under the stress. Some people wanted to turn back, others wanted to continue forward, and a few were talking about splitting up to improve their odds. The Morrison family was falling further behind, and their elderly parents were showing signs of serious heat exhaustion. Dr. Valdez was rationing our water supplies, but even with strict conservation, we'd run out within 12 hours. We were facing the same choice that had divided us at the hotel: abandon the weak to save the strong, or risk everyone to save anyone. The tunnel system was forcing us to make decisions that would have been unthinkable 2 days earlier. How many people were we willing to sacrifice to save the rest? How far would we go to survive? I was trying to hold the group together when we heard the first sounds from behind us. Footsteps in the tunnel, echoing off the concrete walls, getting closer. The infected had found our trail, and they were following us into the storm drain system. We weren't alone in the tunnels anymore. The hunt was about to begin all over again, and this time we had nowhere to run. The footsteps in the tunnel behind us weren't random. They had rhythm, purpose, the measured pace of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. We'd been walking through the storm drain system for 3 hours, and somehow the infected had tracked us into the underground maze. The concrete walls amplified every sound, turning their approach into a countdown that echoed through the darkness. I made the hardest decision of my life in that tunnel. We had 36 people, including 6 children, and 4 elderly individuals who couldn't move fast enough to outrun our pursuers. The Morrison family's grandparents were showing severe signs of heat exhaustion, and Dr. Valdez had warned me that forcing them to continue at our current pace could kill them. But stopping meant the infected would catch up to all of us. I split our group. Maria Santos would take the 18 strongest people and continue through the tunnel system toward what we hoped was safety. I would stay behind with the families, the elderly, and Dr. Valdez to slow down the infected and buy the others time to escape. It was a sacrifice play, the kind of heroic gesture I'd performed dozens of times in movies. The difference was that this time, the people who died would stay dead. The tunnel junction where we made our stand was wider than the main passage, with maintenance alcoves that provided some cover. Jimmy Rodriguez had found emergency supplies stored in metal boxes. Along the walls, flashlights, basic tools, and a first aid kit that Dr. Valdez immediately claimed. It wasn't much, but it was more than we'd had at the hotel. We used the tools to create makeshift weapons from pieces of broken concrete and metal pipes. The elderly Morrison grandparents couldn't fight, so we positioned them in the deepest alcove. With the children, Dr. Valdez would stay with them, providing medical support and serving as our last line of defense if everything else failed. That left 12 adults to face whatever was coming through the tunnel. The infected appeared in our flashlight beams like creatures from a nightmare. They moved with inhuman coordination, their clouded eyes reflecting the light as they approached. Our position. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more in the darkness beyond our vision. They'd learned to hunt in packs, communicating through gestures and sounds that almost resembled language. The first wave hit us like a tsunami of teeth and claws. I'd done hundreds of fight scenes in movies, choreographed battles where every move was planned and every outcome was predetermined. This was nothing like that. There was no script, no safety coordinator, no director to call cut when things went wrong. There was only desperate violence in a concrete tunnel, with lives depending on every decision I made. Jimmy Rodriguez was the first to go down. He'd positioned himself at the front of our defensive line, swinging a metal pipe at anything that came within reach. One of the infected grabbed the pipe and used it to pull him forward, and 3 others were on him before he could break free. His screams echoed through the tunnel until they were suddenly cut short. The Morrison family patriarch, a 70-year-old retired teacher named Robert, surprised everyone by charging into the fight with a piece of broken concrete. He managed to take down 2 infected before they overwhelmed him, buying precious seconds for the rest of us to reorganize our defense. His wife Eleanor was screaming his name from the alcove, but there was nothing any of us could do to save him. Dr. Valdez was shouting medical instructions from her position with the children, telling us where to hit the infected to disable them. Most effectively, the base of the skull, she said, or severe damage to the spinal column. The infected were still human enough to be stopped by massive trauma to their central nervous system. The problem was getting close enough to inflict that kind of damage without being torn apart ourselves. The tunnel was working against us. The narrow space limited our movement and forced us to fight in close quarters where the infected speed and coordination gave them every advantage. We couldn't retreat because we were protecting the people in the alcoves. We couldn't advance because there were too many of them. All we could do was hold our ground and hope that Maria Santos and her group had enough time to escape. Tom Morrison was fighting like a man possessed, using a section of pipe to batter infected that got too close to his family's hiding place. His teenage daughter Sarah had picked up a flashlight and was using it to blind attackers, giving the adults split-second advantages in the chaotic melee. Even his 7-year-old son was helping, throwing pieces of concrete at infected who were focused on other targets. The second wave was smaller but more organized. The infected had observed our defensive tactics and adapted their approach accordingly. They came at us from multiple angles, using the tunnel's alcoves and maintenance passages to attack from unexpected directions. We were being outflanked by creatures we'd assumed were mindless beasts. That's when I realized something that changed everything about how I understood the outbreak. The infected weren't just coordinated, they were learning. They were studying our behavior, identifying our weaknesses, and modifying their tactics based on what they observed. Whatever had happened to their brains, it hadn't eliminated their intelligence. It had just redirected it toward hunting and killing. Eleanor Patterson, the contest winner who'd been wearing an evening gown at the premiere, had become one of our most effective fighters. She'd found a maintenance hammer in one of the supply boxes, and she was using it with surgical precision to disable infected attackers. Her technique was better than mine, more efficient and less wasteful of energy. She'd never been in a real fight before, but she was adapting faster than people with military training. The infected were adapting too. They'd learned to grab our weapons and turn them against us. They'd figured out that our flashlights were both tools and vulnerabilities, providing light we needed but also making us easy targets. Most disturbing of all, they'd started to coordinate their attacks with what sounded like vocal communication, grunts and growls that carried meaning we couldn't understand. We held them off for 27 minutes. I know the exact time because Dr. Valdez was monitoring her watch, timing the engagement so she could report our defensive duration to any rescue teams that might eventually search the tunnels. 27 minutes of desperate combat against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger and smarter with each passing moment. Then our defenses collapsed. The infected had found a maintenance passage that connected to our junction from above. They dropped down behind our defensive line, cutting us off from the alcoves where the children and elderly were hiding. Suddenly, we were fighting on two fronts, and our small force was being systematically destroyed. Dr. Valdez was the last person I saw before the tunnel filled with infected. She was standing in front of the alcove with the children, holding a scalpel she'd found in the first aid kit, facing down 3 attackers who were moving toward her with deliberate intent. She looked back at me for just a moment, and I saw something in her eyes that I'll never forget. Not fear or despair, but a kind of fierce determination that said she would die before she let them reach the children behind her. I never found out if she succeeded. The tunnel junction became a massacre, and I was forced to run. Not because I was a coward, but because staying meant dying for nothing. The people I'd been trying to protect were already lost, and the only thing I could accomplish by remaining was to add my body to the pile. So I ran through the darkness, following the tunnel that Maria Santos and her group had taken, hoping I could catch up to them before the infected caught up to me. The tunnel system was more complex than any of us had realized. Passages branched and reconnected in patterns that defied logic, creating a 3-dimensional maze that could confuse even experienced spelunkers. I was running blind, following maintenance arrows that might have been decades old, trusting my life to infrastructure that was never designed for human navigation. The infected weren't following me. That should have been reassuring, but instead it was terrifying. It meant they were confident I was trapped, that all the tunnels led to dead ends or areas they controlled. They didn't need to chase me because they knew I had nowhere to go. I found Maria Santos and her group 3 hours later, huddled in a maintenance chamber that connected to the city's main water distribution system. They'd been waiting for me, hoping I would catch up, but they were preparing to move on without me. Survival had made hard choices easier to accept. 17 people had made it out of the junction alive. Maria Santos, the maintenance worker, who knew the tunnel systems, a young couple who'd been at the premiere, 6 hotel employees who joined our group during the night, and 7 other survivors whose names I'm ashamed to say I never learned. 17 people out of the 48 who'd trusted me to lead them to safety. The maintenance chamber was larger than the tunnels, with concrete walls lined with pipes and gauges that monitored the city's water pressure. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination, and the air was cooler but heavy with moisture that made breathing difficult. It felt like being inside the belly of some enormous machine, surrounded by the infrastructure that kept civilization functioning. Maria Santos had been monitoring radio transmissions while they waited for me, and the news was worse than anything we'd imagined. The infection wasn't limited to Phoenix anymore. Similar outbreaks were being reported in Tucson, Flagstaff, and cities across Arizona where Vital Boost had been distributed. The National Guard was establishing containment zones around each affected area, but the infected were breaking through their perimeters faster than new ones could be erected. The federal government had declared a state of national emergency. All civilian flights were grounded, Major highways were under military control, and anyone attempting to leave quarantine zones was being turned back by force. We weren't just trapped in Phoenix. We were trapped in a country that was being systematically overrun by creatures that had once been our neighbors, friends, and family members. The hotel employee who joined our group was a communications technician, and he'd managed to tap into the city's emergency broadcast system using equipment in the maintenance chamber. What we heard made our tunnel fight seem like a minor skirmish in a much larger war. The infected were organizing into larger groups, coordinating attacks on military positions and displaying tactical intelligence that suggested some kind of command structure. Military analysts were calling them Zulu-class entities, a designation that acknowledged their human origin while recognizing that they were no longer the same species. They retained enough cognitive function to use tools, plan attacks, and learn from their mistakes, but they'd lost all capacity for empathy, communication, or peaceful coexistence. They existed only to hunt, kill, and create more of their kind. The technician had also intercepted communications between National Guard units, and what he'd learned was terrifying. The military was losing ground faster than they could establish new defensive positions. Infected groups were growing exponentially, not just through new bites but through coordinated raids on survivor settlements. Every successful attack made them stronger and more organized. The federal response was shifting from containment to damage control. Instead of trying to save everyone, they were focusing on protecting major population centers and strategic infrastructure. Phoenix was being written off as a total loss, along with most of Arizona's smaller cities. The survivors in our tunnel weren't being rescued. We were being sacrificed to buy time for evacuation efforts in more important locations. We had 3 options, none of them good. We could stay in the maintenance chamber and hope the infection burned itself out before we died of thirst or starvation. We could continue through the tunnel system and try to reach the National Guard perimeter, risking being shot as infected or turned away as potential carriers. Or we could surface in Phoenix and attempt to find vehicles, supplies, and a route out of the quarantine zone. The debate that followed revealed how much our group had changed since the hotel. There were no more discussions about moral obligations or protecting the weak. Everyone understood that survival required hard choices and calculated risks. The only question was which gamble offered the best odds of staying alive. The young couple, whose names were Alex and Jennifer, wanted to surface and look for vehicles. They'd been monitoring radio chatter from survivor groups throughout the city, and some were reporting success in finding working cars and motorcycles. The key was moving fast, staying quiet, and avoiding areas where the infected had established territorial control. The hotel employees favored staying in the maintenance chamber. They knew the city's infrastructure better than anyone, and they believed they could survive underground indefinitely by tapping into water supplies and finding food in commercial storage facilities. The tunnels were defensible, they argued, and patience was safer than action. Maria Santos proposed the most ambitious plan. She wanted to continue through the tunnel system to the edge of the city, then surface near the National Guard perimeter and attempt to negotiate passage through the quarantine line. Her security background had taught her that military units always had protocols for handling civilian refugees, and she believed we could convince them to make an exception. I was listening to these debates when the maintenance chamber's emergency lighting failed. The darkness was absolute and immediate, like being buried alive. We'd been so focused on planning our next move that we'd ignored the deteriorating condition of our current shelter. The chamber's power system was failing, and we were about to lose the air circulation that made this space habitable. Emergency lighting clicked on after 30 seconds, but it was dimmer than before and flickered constantly. The backup power wouldn't last long, and when it failed, we'd be trapped in a concrete box with no light, no air circulation, and no way to monitor the tunnels for approaching threats. The decision was made for us. We had to move, regardless of the risks, because staying meant certain death from suffocation or carbon dioxide poisoning. The only question was which direction to go. Maria Santos had been studying the tunnel maps. While we debated, and she'd identified a route that might get us to the surface near Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. The airport was outside the main infection zone, according to radio reports, and it might have working vehicles or even aircraft. That could get us out of Arizona entirely. The route would take us through 6 miles of tunnel, including sections that were partially flooded from broken water mains. We'd be walking through knee-deep water in complete darkness, following maintenance arrows that might lead to dead ends or infected nests. But it was the only path that offered any hope of reaching safety. We left the maintenance chamber in single file, using our remaining flashlights to navigate the flooded tunnels. The water was cold and moved with enough current to make walking treacherous. Debris floated past us in the darkness, pieces of the city's infrastructure that had been torn loose by the violence above. The flooded section was worse than Maria Santos had predicted. The water level rose to waist-deep in some areas, and the current was strong enough to knock people off their feet. Alex lost his footing and was swept downstream before Jennifer could grab him. We spent 20 minutes searching for him in the dark water before we heard his voice calling from a side passage, where he'd managed to grab a pipe and pull himself to safety. The tunnel system was betraying us at every turn. Passages that should have connected were blocked by debris. Maintenance arrows pointed in directions that led to dead ends. Water levels rose and fell unpredictably, suggesting that the city's infrastructure was collapsing faster than we could navigate through it. We'd been walking for 4 hours when we encountered the first sign that we weren't alone in the tunnels. Fresh scratches on the concrete walls, too regular to be accidental damage. The infected had been here recently, marking their territory or leaving signals for others to follow. We were walking through claimed hunting grounds, and the hunters might return at any time. The airport was still 2 miles away when we found the bodies. They were stacked in a side chamber like cordwood, dozens of them, all showing signs of the same systematic violence we'd witnessed at the hotel. But these weren't random victims. They were wearing military uniforms, National Guard patches clearly visible on their torn fatigues. The infected hadn't just overrun civilian positions. They'd defeated organized military resistance. The implications were staggering. If the National Guard couldn't hold defensive positions against the infected, what chance did civilian survivors have? If trained soldiers with military equipment were being systematically slaughtered, how could 17 people with makeshift weapons hope to reach safety? Maria Santos was examining the bodies when she made a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the infected. The soldiers hadn't just been killed. They'd been partially consumed, but in a selective pattern that suggested intelligence rather than simple hunger. Organs had been removed with surgical precision, and the remaining tissue showed signs of deliberate preservation. The infected weren't just killing for food or territory. They were harvesting resources for some purpose we couldn't understand. The systematic nature of the consumption suggested planning, organization, and long-term thinking that contradicted everything we'd been told about their supposed mindlessness. We were still processing this information when we heard movement in the tunnel behind us. Footsteps in the water, multiple sets, approaching our position with the same measured pace we'd encountered at the junction. The infected had found our trail again, and this time there was nowhere to run. The tunnel ahead was blocked by debris from a collapsed section. The side passages were too narrow for our group to navigate quickly. We were trapped in a flooded corridor with an unknown number of infected approaching from behind, and no clear escape route ahead. I looked at the 17 people who had followed me this far, who had trusted my leadership despite the deaths it had already caused, and I realized that I was about to fail them again. We'd come so far, survived so much only to be cornered. in a tunnel that was about to become our tomb. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear other sounds now. Voices, if you could call them that. The infected were communicating with each other, coordinating their approach, planning their attack. They'd learned from their encounter at the junction, and they weren't going to make the same mistakes twice. We had maybe 2 minutes before they reached us, and I still had no idea how to save the people who were depending on me to get them out of this nightmare alive. The debris blocking our path turned out to be our salvation. What I'd thought was a collapsed tunnel section was actually a maintenance access point that had been damaged by the flooding. Maria Santos found handholds in the concrete rubble, and we were able to climb over the obstruction into a parallel drainage system that ran toward the airport. The infected voices behind us grew fainter as we put distance between ourselves and the flooded corridor, but I knew they would find our trail. Eventually, the new tunnel system was different from the storm drains we'd been navigating. These passages were smaller, designed for maintenance access rather than flood control, and they connected to Phoenix's electrical and telecommunications infrastructure. The walls were lined with cables, and junction boxes and emergency lighting provided intermittent illumination as we moved through the network. Alex had twisted his ankle during the climb over the debris, and Jennifer was helping him walk. The injury slowed our progress, but it also revealed something important about our group dynamics. No one suggested leaving him behind. We'd lost so many people that the survivors had developed an unspoken commitment to protecting each other, even when it compromised our collective safety. The communications technician, whose name was Robert Chun, had found a working terminal in one of the junction boxes, and he was monitoring emergency broadcasts as we traveled. The news was consistently terrible, but it was also revealing patterns that helped us understand what was happening beyond Phoenix. The infection was spreading faster in urban areas where Vital Boost had been widely distributed, but rural communities were holding out longer. The federal government was establishing refugee camps in areas with low population density, places where the infected couldn't easily organize large-scale attacks. The nearest refugee camp was in Flagstaff, more than 100 miles north of Phoenix. Getting there would require vehicles, fuel, and passage through territory that was increasingly controlled by infected groups. But it was a destination, a goal that gave us something to work toward beyond simple survival. We'd been moving through the maintenance tunnels for 2 hours when we encountered the first evidence of organized infected activity. The tunnels showed signs of systematic modification, with cables cut in specific patterns and junction boxes deliberately damaged. The infected weren't just using the infrastructure. They were sabotaging it, cutting Phoenix off from outside communication and coordination. This wasn't random destruction. It was strategic warfare. The realization that we were facing an enemy with long-term planning capabilities changed everything about our situation. The infected weren't just predators hunting for food. They were an invasive species working to eliminate competition for territory and resources. Every human they killed or converted made them stronger. Every piece of infrastructure they destroyed made it harder for survivors to organize resistance. Maria Santos had been tracking our position using landmarks in the tunnel system, and she estimated we were within a mile of Sky Harbor Airport. But the maintenance tunnels didn't connect directly to the airport complex. We'd have to surface and travel the final distance above ground, through territory that might be crawling with infected. The communications technician had been monitoring air traffic control frequencies, and what he'd learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The airport was still partially operational, with military aircraft using it as a staging area for evacuation flights. But civilian access was severely restricted, and anyone approaching the facility without proper authorization was being turned away by armed guards. We needed a plan that would get us past military security without being shot as potential threats. The problem was that we looked exactly like what the guards were, trained to fear desperate survivors who might be infected or carrying the infection. We were dirty, exhausted, and armed with makeshift weapons. In low light conditions, we could easily be mistaken for hostile forces. The young couple Alex and Jennifer proposed a risky strategy. Jennifer had worked in public relations before the outbreak, and she understood how to manage perceptions and control narratives. If we could establish communication with the airport security forces before approaching their perimeter, we might be able to negotiate safe passage by providing valuable intelligence about infected activity in the city. The intelligence we'd gathered was significant. We knew the infected were using the tunnel systems for movement and coordination. We'd observed their tactical adaptations and strategic planning capabilities. We'd seen evidence of systematic infrastructure sabotage. This information could be valuable to military planners who were still treating the infected as mindless zombies rather than organized enemies. Robert Chun had the technical skills to establish radio contact with airport security, but he needed better equipment than the emergency terminals in the maintenance tunnels. The solution was to reach a communications hub on the surface, one of the relay stations that connected Phoenix's emergency services network. Maria Santos knew the location of several such facilities, and one was relatively close to our current position. The plan required splitting our group again. Robert Chun, Maria Santos, and 2 volunteers would surface to establish radio contact with the airport. The rest of us would wait in the tunnels, ready to move quickly once communication was established. It was another calculated risk, but every option involved gambling with lives we couldn't afford to lose. The communications relay station was housed in a concrete building that looked like a small fortress. Solar panels on the roof provided independent power, and the facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It had been designed to operate during emergencies, and the outbreak apparently qualified. Maria Santos and her team were gone for 3 hours. When they returned, they brought news that fundamentally changed our understanding of the situation in Phoenix. The military wasn't just establishing evacuation flights from Sky Harbor Airport. They were preparing to implement something called Protocol 7, a federal emergency response that I'd never heard of, but that terrified the airport personnel. Protocol 7 was a sterilization directive. If the infection couldn't be contained within the next 12 hours, the federal government was authorized to use extreme measures to prevent its spread to other regions. The exact nature of these measures was classified, but the airport personnel were being evacuated to positions outside a 30-mile radius of downtown Phoenix. They were going to destroy the city. The timeline was impossibly tight. The last evacuation flight was scheduled to depart at dawn, less than 8 hours away. After that, Sky Harbor Airport would be abandoned, and anyone remaining in the Phoenix metropolitan area would be written off as acceptable losses in the larger battle against the infection. We had to reach the airport before dawn, or we'd be trapped in a city that was about to be erased from the map. The route to the airport required traveling 2 miles across surface streets that were controlled by infected groups. The airport security forces had provided Robert Chun with intelligence about safe corridors and areas to avoid, but the information was hours old and the situation was changing rapidly. Streets that had been clear at midnight might be overrun. By 3 in the morning, we surfaced through a storm drain near the airport's cargo handling facility, emerging into a world that looked like a war zone. Abandoned vehicles littered the streets, their doors hanging open where drivers had fled in panic. Traffic lights blinked red in empty intersections, their signals serving no purpose except to mark the failure of organized society. Smoke rose from dozens of fires throughout the city, and the smell of burning plastic and decomposing bodies carried on the desert wind. The airport was visible in the distance, its control tower and terminal buildings lit by emergency lighting. Military helicopters circled the perimeter, their searchlights scanning the approaches for signs of infected activity. The facility looked like an island of civilization in an ocean of chaos, but it was an island that would soon be abandoned. We moved through the cargo area in single file, using abandoned shipping containers for cover. The infected were active in this area, but they seemed to be avoiding the immediate vicinity of the airport. Whether this was due to military patrols or some other factor, we couldn't determine, but it gave us a narrow corridor of relative safety. The first checkpoint was a National Guard position blocking the main access road to the airport. 2 armored vehicles flanked a concrete barrier, and soldiers in full combat gear were scanning the approaches with night vision equipment. Radio contact had been established, but approaching armed military personnel in the dark was still dangerous for nervous, trigger fingers. Maria Santos had military experience from her security contracting days, and she knew the protocols for approaching checkpoints safely. She went first, hands visible, moving slowly, calling out our group's authentication codes before the soldiers could challenge us. The process took 20 minutes of careful negotiation, but eventually we were cleared to approach the checkpoint. The soldiers were professional, but clearly under extreme stress. They'd been fighting infected groups for 36 hours straight, and they'd seen things that challenged their understanding of warfare. The infected weren't just attacking random targets. They were conducting coordinated assaults on specific strategic positions, using tactics that suggested military training or intelligence guidance. One of the soldiers, a sergeant whose name tag read Williams, told us about an attack on their previous position that had demonstrated unprecedented coordination. The infected had used diversionary tactics to split the defensive forces, then concentrated their assault on the weakest point in the perimeter. When the soldiers fell back to secondary positions, the infected had anticipated their movement and established ambush positions along their retreat route. These weren't random monsters driven by hunger. They were organized forces conducting systematic warfare against human resistance. The checkpoint commander authorized our passage to the airport terminal, but he warned us that civilian evacuation was extremely limited. Priority was being given to essential personnel, military families, and individuals with critical skills. 17 random survivors from a hotel premier weren't likely to qualify for scarce seats on evacuation aircraft. The airport terminal was a refugee camp in miniature, packed with hundreds of people who were hoping for evacuation, but would probably be left behind. Families huddled around piles of luggage, children crying from exhaustion and fear. Airport personnel were processing evacuation lists with mechanical efficiency, checking names against databases and assigning boarding priorities based on criteria that seemed arbitrary and cruel. I realized that our group's survival might depend on factors beyond our control. We'd made it to the airport, established contact with evacuation authorities, and provided valuable intelligence about infected activities. But none of that guaranteed us seats on aircraft that were already overbooked with more important passengers. The processing desk was staffed by a civilian coordinator who looked like she hadn't slept in days. She reviewed our identification documents and listened to our story with professional detachment, making notes in a computer system that would determine our fate. Our group was assigned Category C priority, which meant we'd be considered for evacuation only if seats remained available after higher priority passengers were accommodated. Category C was essentially a death sentence dressed up in bureaucratic language. Jennifer's public relations background proved valuable again. She approached the coordination desk with a proposal that reframed our status from desperate refugees to valuable intelligence assets. The information we'd gathered about infected tactical capabilities was significant enough to warrant debriefing by military intelligence officers. If we could provide details that helped the military understand their enemy, we might qualify for protected witness status and guaranteed evacuation. The intelligence debriefing was conducted by a colonel whose unit specialized in analyzing enemy capabilities and intentions. He listened to our reports about infected coordination, strategic planning, and infrastructure sabotage with growing concern. The patterns we described matched intelligence gathered from other outbreak zones, but our observations provided crucial details about the speed and sophistication of infected tactical adaptation. The Colonel was particularly interested in our encounter with the systematically harvested soldiers in the tunnel. The selective consumption of organs suggested that the infected weren't just killing for food or territory. They were collecting biological materials for some purpose that the military hadn't yet identified. This information could be critical for understanding the long-term threat posed by the infection. Our debriefing lasted 2 hours, during which time the airport was experiencing its own crisis. Infected groups had been detected approaching the perimeter, and military forces were preparing for what could be the final assault before evacuation was completed. The timing was critical. If the infected breached airport security before the last aircraft departed, hundreds of civilians would be trapped with no escape route. The Colonel upgraded our evacuation status to Category A based on the intelligence we'd provided, but he also delivered sobering news about our destination. The Flagstaff refugee camp was already overcrowded and facing supply shortages. More troubling, it was reporting its own infected incidents among refugees who had passed initial screening. The infection was spreading faster than containment efforts could track it. We were given boarding passes for the 6:30 morning flight, but we were also warned that the situation could change rapidly. If infected forces breached the airport perimeter, all evacuation flights would be canceled and the facility would be abandoned. The aircraft would depart without passengers rather than risk spreading the infection to other regions. The terminal building was becoming increasingly chaotic as dawn approached. More refugees were arriving from across the city. Desperate people who had fought their way through infected territory for a chance at evacuation. The coordination staff was overwhelmed, processing hundreds of applications for dozens of available seats. Families were being separated as evacuation criteria prioritized individuals over groups. Alex's injured ankle had worsened during our journey to the airport, and he was showing signs of infection from a cut he'd sustained in the tunnels. Jennifer was torn between staying with him and accepting evacuation for herself. The medical staff determined that Alex needed surgery that wouldn't be available at the refugee camp, but they also couldn't guarantee that medical facilities in Flagstaff would be operational when we arrived. It was another impossible choice in a series of decisions that had no good outcomes. The infected assault on the airport began at 5:15 in the morning, 45 minutes before our scheduled departure. The attack was more sophisticated than anything the military had encountered, with infected forces approaching from multiple directions, using coordinated timing that suggested central command authority. They disabled perimeter lighting with targeted attacks on power systems, then used the darkness to mask their assault routes. The terminal building shook as explosions echoed across the runway. Military forces were engaging infected groups at 3 separate breach points, and radio traffic indicated that the defensive perimeter was failing faster than anticipated. The evacuation timeline was compressed from 45 minutes to 15, with only the most critical flights being allowed to depart. Our flight was canceled. The boarding gate displays showed red cancellation notices for all civilian evacuation flights. Only military personnel and essential government officials would be evacuated before the airport was abandoned. The hundreds of refugees in the terminal were being directed to emergency shelters that would offer temporary protection, but no guarantee of survival. I watched families realize that they'd traveled across a city full of monsters for nothing. Parents held children who didn't understand why the promised rescue had been taken away. Elderly couples who had survived 48 hours of hell broke down crying as they faced the reality that they would die in Phoenix after all. The terminal was being evacuated, but not to aircraft. Military personnel were directing refugees to reinforced areas of the airport complex that could serve as temporary shelters. The storage areas, maintenance facilities, and cargo handling buildings were being fortified as defensive positions for civilians who had nowhere else to go. Maria Santos was studying the airport layout maps when she identified our last possible escape route. The cargo area had its own aircraft service capabilities, including smaller planes that were used for freight and emergency medical transport. If we could reach the cargo facility before it was overrun, we might find aircraft that could carry our group to safety. The plan required crossing an active battlefield in the dark, navigating through areas where military forces were engaging. Infected attackers. We'd be moving through crossfire zones where soldiers might mistake us for hostiles, and we'd have no protection except speed and luck. 17 people had made it to the airport. 17 people who had survived a hotel massacre, a tunnel siege, and a cross-city journey through infected territory. We'd lost 31 members of our original group, and now we were facing another deadly gamble with odds that seemed to worsen with every choice we made. The cargo facility was 300 yards from the terminal building, across an open area that was currently being swept by military searchlights. Infected forces were pressing the perimeter from multiple directions, and the defensive fire was intensifying as soldiers struggled to hold their positions. We'd have to time our movement to avoid both the infected assault and the military response. Robert Chun had established radio contact with cargo facility personnel, and they'd confirmed that several aircraft were still operational. But the facility's security forces were preparing to abandon their positions within the next 30 minutes. If we couldn't reach them before they withdrew, we'd be trapped in an airport that was about to be overrun by infected forces. The sprint across the tarmac was the longest 300 yards of my life. Military helicopters circled overhead, their guns targeting infected groups that were breaching the perimeter in multiple locations. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks, and the sound of automatic weapons fire was constant and overwhelming. We made it to the cargo facility with minutes to spare, diving through the loading dock doors as infected forces overran the military positions we'd just crossed. The cargo area was controlled chaos, with personnel loading critical equipment onto the last departing aircraft while security teams prepared final defensive positions. There was one aircraft left, a twin-engine cargo plane that was being loaded with medical supplies for the Flagstaff refugee camp. The pilot was a civilian contractor who'd been hired to make supply runs between outbreak zones. He had room for passengers, but he also had direct orders not to accept unauthorized personnel who might compromise his mission. Jennifer's negotiation skills proved crucial one final time. She convinced the pilot that our intelligence about infected tactical capabilities made U.S. valuable assets for the refugee camp security planning. We weren't just 17 more mouths to feed. We were experienced survivors who could help other refugees understand the threats they were facing. The pilot agreed to take us, but only if we were willing to help defend the aircraft during departure. The infected had overrun most of the airport, and taking off would require flying through territory where they might have surface-to-air capabilities. Our role would be to watch for threats and provide additional eyes during the most dangerous phase of our escape. The cargo plane's engines were spinning up when infected forces breached the cargo facility's perimeter. Security teams were falling back to the aircraft, covering the final loading operations while engaging targets that were getting closer every second. We could see them in the darkness beyond the runway lights, hundreds of figures moving with coordinated purpose toward our last hope of escape. The plane was taxiing toward the runway when I realized something that should have been obvious hours earlier. The infected assault on the airport wasn't random or opportunistic. They'd timed their attack to disrupt the evacuation schedule, targeting the moment when maximum numbers of civilians would be trapped in an indefensible position. They'd planned this. The infected weren't just trying to kill us. They were trying to prevent us from escaping, from carrying information about their capabilities to other survivor communities. Our intelligence about their tactical sophistication made us threats that needed to be eliminated before we could share what we'd learned. The plane lifted off just as infected forces reached the runway, and I could see them in the landing lights as we climbed into the darkness. They weren't running randomly or chasing the aircraft out of simple aggression. They were standing in organized formations, watching our departure with what looked like calculated assessment. They were learning from this encounter too, studying our escape methods and defensive capabilities for use against the next group of survivors who tried to flee their territory. Every battle made them smarter. Every engagement taught them new tactics they could apply to future operations. We were flying toward Flagstaff and temporary safety, but we were also carrying the terrifying knowledge that the infected weren't just monsters to be defeated. They were an evolving enemy that was getting more dangerous with every encounter, and they were spreading faster than anyone had imagined. The refugee camp we were approaching might already be compromised, and the country we were trying to reach might be losing a war it didn't even realize it was fighting. The flight to Flagstaff took 2 hours through airspace that had become a war zone. Our pilot, whose name was Captain Rodriguez, monitored military frequencies as we flew north, and the radio chatter painted a picture of systematic collapse across Arizona. Infected groups were coordinating attacks on multiple cities simultaneously, suggesting a level of strategic planning that no one in the federal government had anticipated. The Flagstaff refugee camp was visible from miles away, a sprawling collection of military tents and prefabricated buildings surrounded by razor wire and guard towers. Searchlights swept the perimeter constantly, and we could see armed patrols moving along the fence line. It looked like a prison designed to keep threats out rather than people in, which should have been reassuring but somehow felt ominous. Captain Rodriguez received landing clearance, but the instructions were more complex than normal. All passengers would be quarantined for 72 hours before being admitted to the general camp population. Medical screening would include blood tests, psychological evaluation, and observation for signs of infection that might not manifest immediately. Anyone showing questionable symptoms would be isolated indefinitely. The quarantine facility was a converted airplane hangar on the edge of the refugee camp. Rows of military cots were separated by thin partitions that provided minimal privacy. Armed guards watched from elevated platforms, and medical personnel in full protective gear conducted regular health checks. It felt more like a laboratory than a shelter, with refugees serving as test subjects in an experiment whose parameters we didn't understand. Our group of 17 was housed together in one section of the hangar, which allowed us to continue the conversations we'd started during our escape from Phoenix. But we quickly discovered that talking about our experiences was discouraged by camp authorities. Information about infected tactical capabilities was classified, and sharing details about their coordination and planning abilities could cause panic among other refugees. The medical screening process revealed disturbing patterns among the refugee population. Dr. Sarah Kim, who was leading the medical team, told us that nearly 30% of incoming refugees were showing neurological anomalies that couldn't be explained by trauma or stress. Brain scans revealed unusual activity in regions associated with aggression and impulse control, suggesting that exposure to infected individuals might cause subtle changes even in people who were never bitten. The infection might be spreading through mechanisms that medical science didn't understand yet. Jennifer had been monitoring conversations among other refugees, and she'd identified several people whose stories didn't match the official timeline of the outbreak. A family from Tucson claimed their city had experienced infected incidents 2 days before the Phoenix premiere, but those reports had been suppressed by local authorities. A truck driver insisted he delivered vital boost to multiple cities across the Southwest, all of which were now reporting similar outbreaks. The pattern suggested that the Phoenix premiere wasn't the beginning of the outbreak. It was just the first incident that couldn't be covered up or contained by local authorities. The infection had been spreading for days or possibly weeks before. Anyone realized what was happening, seated by a distribution network that had carried contaminated products across multiple states. Robert Chun had gained access to the camp's communication systems, and what he discovered was terrifying. Military intelligence was tracking similar outbreaks in Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah, every location where Vital Boost had been distributed in the weeks before the Phoenix incident was experiencing infected activity. The company's distribution network had become a biological weapon delivery system, whether intentionally or accidentally. The federal response was shifting from containment to damage assessment. Instead of trying to stop the outbreak, government agencies were calculating acceptable losses and establishing defensive perimeters around major population centers. States with significant Vital Boost distribution were being written off as combat zones, their populations sacrificed to prevent the infection from reaching the east and west coasts. Maria Santos had been conducting her own intelligence gathering among camp security personnel, and she'd learned that the Flagstaff facility was itself under threat. Infected groups from Phoenix and Tucson were moving north in coordinated formations, suggesting that they were specifically targeting refugee camps rather than spreading randomly. The camp's defensive capabilities were adequate for defending against unorganized attacks, but they weren't designed to withstand the kind of sophisticated assault we'd witnessed at Sky Harbor Airport. The quarantine period was supposed to last 72 hours, but on our second day, camp authorities announced an indefinite extension. Several refugees in other sections of the facility had developed symptoms that resembled early-stage infection, and medical personnel were struggling to determine whether these cases represented new infections or delayed manifestations of previous exposure. The camp was becoming a prison, and we were becoming long-term inmates rather than temporary refugees. Alex's ankle injury had become severely infected during our journey, and the camp medical staff had performed emergency surgery to prevent the infection from spreading to his bloodstream. The operation was successful, but it revealed something unexpected in his tissue samples. His immune system was producing antibodies that had never been documented before, suggesting that exposure to infected individuals might trigger evolutionary adaptations in some survivors. Dr. Kim was fascinated by Alex's case, but she was also concerned about its implications. If the infection was causing genetic changes in survivors, then the refugee camps might be incubating a new variant of humanity rather than preserving the original version. The long-term consequences of these adaptations were unknown, but they raised questions about whether survivors would still be fully human after extended exposure to the outbreak environment. The psychological evaluations were revealing similar anomalies. Refugees who had survived direct contact with infected individuals were showing enhanced pattern recognition, improved reflexes, and increased aggression responses. These changes could be adaptive benefits that helped people survive in the post-outbreak world, but they could also be early signs of the same neurological alterations that characterize the infected themselves. We might be evolving into something new, something that could survive in a world dominated by creatures that had once been human. The camp's radio monitoring station was intercepting communications from other refugee facilities, and the reports were consistently grim. The Denver camp had been overrun by coordinated infected assault. The Salt Lake City facility was under siege by groups that were using military tactics and captured equipment. The Las Vegas shelter had been abandoned after infected forces demonstrated the ability to breach fortified perimeters through coordinated tunneling operations. The refugee camp system was failing across the Southwest, and the Flagstaff facility was likely to be next. Camp Commander Colonel Martinez called a general assembly on our third day to address growing panic among the refugee population. His briefing was carefully worded to avoid revealing classified information, But the message was clear. The camp was being reinforced with additional military personnel. Defensive positions were being strengthened, and evacuation plans were being developed in case the facility became untenable. He didn't say that we were trapped in a target that would soon be under attack by enemies that had already demonstrated the ability to defeat similar defensive positions. He didn't need to. Everyone in the camp understood that we were living on borrowed time in a temporary shelter that might not survive the week. The evacuation plans were limited and selective. Priority would be given to essential personnel, individuals with critical skills, and people whose survival was deemed important for rebuilding efforts. The vast majority of refugees would remain at the camp, regardless of the threat level, because there was nowhere else for them to go. Our group's intelligence value had earned us a place on the priority evacuation list, but only if we agreed to serve as advisors for military planning efforts. The federal government needed people who understood infected tactical capabilities, and our first-hand experience made us valuable resources for developing countermeasures against coordinated attacks. The offer came with strings attached. We would be separated from other refugees and housed in secure facilities where our knowledge could be fully debriefed. We would become military assets rather than civilian survivors, with all the benefits and restrictions that status entailed. Our freedom would be traded for security, and our future would be determined by people who saw us as tools rather than human beings. Jennifer led the debate within our group about whether to accept the government's offer. The arguments were familiar from our earlier discussions about survival priorities and moral obligations. Some people wanted to accept any opportunity that improved their chances of living through the crisis. Others believed that preserving their humanity was more important than maximizing their survival odds. I found myself thinking about the people we'd lost during our escape from Phoenix. Dr. Valdez, who had died protecting children in a tunnel. Jimmy Rodriguez, who had led us through dangerous territory at the cost of his own life. The Morrison grandparents, who had fought infected attackers despite their age and frailty. They had made choices based on principles rather than calculations, and their sacrifices had meaning that extended beyond simple survival. The decision was complicated by intelligence that Robert Chun had gathered about the government's long-term plans for dealing with the outbreak. Military planners were developing strategies that assumed large portions of the country would be permanently lost to infected control. The goal wasn't to reclaim occupied territory, but to establish sustainable defensive perimeters around reduced population centers. The America we had known was being officially abandoned in favor of a smaller, more defensible version that could survive in a world where infected forces controlled vast territories. The refugee camps weren't temporary shelters. They were processing centers where the remaining human population would be sorted into categories: useful, expendable, and threatening. Our group's value as intelligence assets protected us from the expendable category, but it also meant we would be complicit in decisions that determined the fate of other survivors. The information we provided would be used to develop military strategies that prioritize some human lives over others. We would become part of a system that was writing off millions of people as acceptable losses. The ethical implications were staggering, but the alternative was to join the ranks of the expendable ourselves. Maria Santos made the case for accepting the government's offer in terms that reflected how much our thinking had changed since the hotel premiere. Survival required cooperation with power structures that might be morally compromised. The perfect choice didn't exist, so we had to choose the option that gave us the best chance of living long enough to influence future decisions. Alex and Jennifer argued for rejecting the offer and remaining with the general refugee population. They believed that maintaining their independence was worth the increased risk, and they worried that becoming government assets would corrupt their judgment about what was truly important. They had seen how survival pressures could erode moral principles. And they didn't want to become the kind of people who made decisions based purely on calculated self-interest. The debate was interrupted by emergency alarms throughout the camp. Perimeter guards had detected movement in the forest surrounding the facility, and thermal imaging was showing large groups approaching from multiple directions. The attack we'd been expecting was beginning, and our philosophical discussions about cooperation and independence had become irrelevant. The infected assault on the Flagstaff refugee camp was more sophisticated than anything we'd witnessed in Phoenix. The attacking forces used diversionary tactics to split the defensive response, then concentrated their main assault on predetermined weak points in the perimeter. They demonstrated knowledge of military doctrine that suggested they were being led by individuals with professional training. The camp's defensive positions were designed to repel unorganized attacks by desperate infected individuals. They weren't prepared for coordinated assault by disciplined units that used covering fire, flanking maneuvers, and tactical communication. The perimeter was breached in 4 locations simultaneously, and infected forces were inside the camp within 20 minutes of the initial contact. The quarantine hangar became a refugee center as people fled from overrun sections of the camp. Hundreds of civilians crowded into a space designed for dozens, and the medical staff was overwhelmed by casualties from the ongoing battle. Camp security forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal toward the administrative center, but they were taking heavy losses against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Our group found ourselves defending the hangar alongside camp security personnel who had never expected to face this level of organized resistance. The infected attackers moved with military precision, using suppressing fire to pin down defenders, while assault teams moved to flanking positions. They had acquired weapons from overrun military positions, and they were using them with competence that suggested retained muscle memory from their previous lives. These weren't mindless zombies driven by hunger. They were soldiers who remembered their training despite being transformed by infection. The hangar's defensive position was untenable, and camp authorities were preparing to evacuate essential personnel to the administration building. Our group was included in the evacuation order because of our intelligence value, but accepting meant abandoning hundreds of refugees who would be left to face the infected attack alone. I looked around the hangar at families who had survived. Impossible journeys to reach what they thought was safety. Children who didn't understand why the promised refuge was being taken away from them. Elderly people who had endured days of travel through infected territory for a chance at protection. That was dissolving before their eyes. They were looking at us with the same trust and desperation I'd seen in the hotel conference center, when 48 people had believed I could lead them to safety. I'd failed them then, losing 31 lives through decisions that seemed logical, but proved catastrophic. Now I had another chance to choose between calculated self-interest and moral responsibility. The evacuation aircraft was warming up on the camp's landing strip, preparing for immediate departure. Camp Commander Colonel Martinez was calling for all priority personnel to board within the next 10 minutes. Anyone who missed the evacuation would be left to face whatever happened when the camp's final defensive positions were overrun. Jennifer made the decision for all of us. She announced that our group would remain at the hangar to help defend the refugees, regardless of the personal cost. We had survived 48 hours of hell by working together and protecting each other. We wouldn't abandon that principle now, even if it meant giving up our best chance of long-term survival. The evacuation aircraft departed without us, carrying camp administrators and military personnel to safety while leaving behind the refugees who had trusted the government to protect them. The sound of its engines fading into the distance marked the moment when we realized that official rescue wasn't coming. We were on our own again, just as we had been in the Phoenix hotel. The infected breakthrough came at dawn when their coordinated assault finally overwhelmed the camp's remaining defensive positions. They poured through the perimeter in organized waves, moving with purpose toward specific targets within the facility. The medical center, the communications hub, the administrative buildings, all were captured by units that seemed to know exactly where to find the most valuable assets. But they didn't attack the quarantine hangar. The infected forces surrounded our position, but didn't attempt to breach our defenses. They established a perimeter that prevented anyone from leaving, but they made no effort to force entry or eliminate the refugees inside. It was like they were containing us rather than destroying us, which raised terrifying questions about their intentions. Robert Chun had maintained radio contact with other facilities, and what he learned suggested that the Flagstaff attack was part of a larger coordinated operation. Similar assaults were occurring simultaneously at refugee camps across the Southwest, all following the same pattern: overwhelming initial assault, capture of strategic positions, and containment of civilian populations. The infected weren't just attacking randomly. They were conducting organized military operations designed to capture territory and resources while preserving human populations for some unknown purpose. The refugees weren't being killed. They were being harvested. The realization that we were facing an intelligent enemy with strategic objectives changed everything about our situation. The infected weren't trying to eliminate humanity. They were trying to control it, to manage human populations like resources that could be exploited for specific purposes. The refugee camps had become collection points where survivors could be efficiently processed and distributed. We were livestock, and the infected were ranchers. The hangar's food and water supplies were running low, and the infected perimeter was preventing any resupply or evacuation attempts. We were slowly starving in a facility that had become a holding pen, waiting for our captors to decide what to do with us. Some refugees were talking about attempting to break out, but the infected forces were too well organized and positioned to make escape realistic. Maria Santos had been observing the infected perimeter positions, and she'd identified patterns in their patrol schedules and communication protocols. They were maintaining discipline that suggested ongoing command authority, but they were also showing signs of adaptation to local conditions. They were learning from their success, refining their tactics based on what worked at each refugee camp they captured. Every victory made them more effective against the next target. The situation stabilized into an uneasy standoff that lasted 3 days. The infected maintained their perimeter while refugees attempted to survive on dwindling supplies. No communication was attempted from either side, but the message was clear: we were prisoners waiting for processing, and resistance would only delay the inevitable outcome. Some refugees began advocating for surrender, arguing that cooperation might lead to better treatment than continued defiance. Others wanted to fight to the end, preferring death to whatever fate awaited captured humans. The debate revealed how much the outbreak had changed people's fundamental assumptions about survival and dignity. I was listening to these arguments when I realized something that offered a slim hope for escape. The infected were maintaining their perimeter, using military doctrine that assumed their prisoners were following conventional resistance patterns. But our group had learned unconventional survival techniques during our escape from Phoenix, including the use of infrastructure systems that military planners might not consider. The Flagstaff facility was built over the same kind of utility tunnel system we'd used to escape the Desert Ridge Resort. If we could access those tunnels without alerting the infected perimeter guards, we might be able to reach the outside world and warn other survivor communities about what was happening at the refugee camps. It would mean abandoning the people in the hangar, just as we'd abandoned people at every previous stage of our journey. But it would also mean preserving information that could save thousands of other survivors from being captured and processed like cattle. The choice between individual loyalty and collective benefit had defined our entire experience since the outbreak began. This time, the stakes were higher than our personal survival. This time, we were choosing between saving the people we knew and saving the people we might never meet. The utility access was located in the hangar's basement, behind equipment storage that would mask our entry from casual observation. The tunnel system connected to the municipal water treatment facility outside the camp perimeter, which might provide a route to vehicles and communication equipment. 6 people volunteered for the escape attempt. Myself, Maria Santos, Robert Chun, Jennifer, Alex despite his injured ankle, and Eleanor Patterson, the contest winner who had become one of our most effective fighters. The other 11 members of our group would remain with the refugees, maintaining the appearance that we were all still confined while secretly preparing for whatever happened when the infected decided to process their prisoners. The basement tunnels were smaller and more restricted than the Phoenix storm drains, but they were also unguarded. The infected had secured the surface approaches to the facility, but they apparently hadn't considered the possibility of underground escape routes. We moved through the tunnel system using maintenance maps that Robert Chun had downloaded from the camp's computer systems. The water treatment facility was abandoned but still operational, its automated systems continuing to process municipal water supplies, despite the absence of human oversight. More importantly, it had vehicle maintenance bays with trucks that were still functional. The facility's communication array was intact, providing access to emergency broadcast networks that could carry warnings to other survivor communities. Robert Chun established contact with survivor groups across the region, while Maria Santos prepared vehicles for long-distance travel. The news we received was worse than we'd feared. The refugee camp system had been systematically compromised, with facilities from Colorado to California reporting similar attacks and containment operations. The infected weren't just spreading randomly. They were implementing a coordinated strategy to capture and control human populations. The federal government's response was shifting toward accepting the loss of the western states and establishing new defensive perimeters along the Mississippi River. Military resources were being withdrawn from combat zones and concentrated in areas where they could defend reduced territory. The infected were being given de facto control over vast regions in exchange for containing their expansion within acceptable geographic boundaries. Millions of people were being written off as losses in a strategic withdrawal that prioritized long-term survival over immediate rescue operations. We had a choice to make that would define not just our own future, but potentially the future of human resistance to the infected occupation. We could flee eastward and seek safety behind the new defensive perimeters, preserving our own lives but abandoning the people we'd left behind. Or we could remain in the occupied territories and work to establish resistance networks that might eventually challenge infected control. The easy choice was obvious. The right choice was harder to determine. I looked at the 5 people who had followed me through 48 hours of impossible decisions and devastating losses. We'd started as strangers thrown together by circumstance, but we'd become something more through shared survival and mutual dependence. We'd learned that leadership wasn't about having the right answers. It was about making necessary decisions when all the options were terrible. We decided to stay and fight, not because we thought we could win, but because abandoning the people who trusted us would make survival meaningless. We would work to establish communication networks between isolated survivor groups, gather intelligence about infected capabilities and intentions, and prepare for a resistance effort that might take years or decades to succeed. The war for humanity was just beginning, and we were going to be part of it whether we survived or not. The people we'd lost during our escape from Phoenix had earned that commitment through their sacrifices. The people we'd left in the refugee camp hangar deserved that dedication despite our inability to save them immediately. We were no longer just survivors trying to escape a nightmare. We were resistance fighters preparing for a conflict that would determine whether humanity had a future in a world that was no longer entirely human. The infected had won the first phase of this war through superior coordination and strategic planning, but they had also revealed their weaknesses, dependence on captured human resources, vulnerability to infrastructure disruption, and reliance on patterns that could be studied and countered. They had turned us into prey, but they had also created predators who understood their methods and motivations. The hunt was about to become mutual, and the outcome was far from certain.